Hi guys, this is your last podcast for my teaching section of this course. I want to give you guys a general idea of what we're doing in this podcast because it's shorter and hopefully it'll help you get through the activity that I'm asking you to do for this one. So what I'm going to try to do is introduce 3 key ideas about conservation biology so that you're very familiar with terminology when you come into class on Wednesday. Then we're going to examine an online database about the organisms on Earth and their current conservation status. Then the goal of that is to illustrate to you that there's a collaborative effort in science to build a database and educate the public on the status of different organisms. Then at the end of this podcast, you guys will complete a worksheet that is available in the same place that you downloaded this podcast or went to the link. Okay, so one of the cool things about conservation biology is it ties together a lot of the principles you've been learning all semester. The goal of conservation biology is to protect and manage biodiversity. You have spent the past 6 weeks talking about what biodiversity is, and by now you probably recognize there are a lot of different ways to categorize it. You can do it simply by naming species like we did for the first part of the class and for the diversity quizzes. But then we also have the evolutionary history of species that we use to organize our biodiversity. And then even more so, there's the ecological role of every species that we have shown on this picture here that tells us a little bit about what biodiversity is out there and how it interacts with each other. So what this means when you tie together multiple different fields into form another one, this is what we call an applied field of biology. So conservation biology is going to tie together ecology, evolution, behavior, and a whole bunch of other different features of those fields together to figure out the best ways to protect and manage biodiversity. It is important to remember within conservation biology that humans are part of the global ecosystem. So in no way is conservation biology aiming to make life more difficult for humans, but instead trying to make the world a better managed and better maintained place for biodiversity, while still being able to incorporate humans into that whole ecosystem. So one of the things we'll talk about in lecture on Wednesday is this idea of the value or the conservation value of a species. And that can be defined based on its evolutionary significance, its ecological significance, the ethical role of maintaining given species and maintaining biodiversity. And we'll talk a bit more about those when you come into class on Wednesday. But keep in mind that part of the reason that humans feel conservation is so important is that there's value to having biodiversity, whether it's economic, whether it's ethical, or whether it's just to understand the biodiversity that's on the planet. There is value to having that biodiversity. So what we want to do next is we want to talk about why we need to have this field of conservation biology and what we're doing to actually conserve, protect, and manage it. Okay, so one of the things about biodiversity that we know is that there are many threats to biodiversity. And what we mean is that there are many things that cause biodiversity to decline. And what I've seen in the past is that these terms seem to be things that get forgotten if we don't review them multiple times. So this is part of the reason we're doing this podcast. So listed on this slide by the bullets are the different major threats to biodiversity that we currently acknowledge. By far, the most influential of all of these is called habitat loss. And this specifically means that the resources necessary for a species to survive are no longer available. So this can be things like food sources. For things like plants, it might be poor soil conditions or the fact that the forests are mowed down or removed. So we're actually removing habitat that used to be for forest or used to be for a certain type of species, and it no longer exists. We can measure habitat loss in a variety of ways. We can measure it as the change in the range. For example, did this animal used to live on an entire continent and now it's restricted to a single island? Alternatively, we can just say it can be measured as the loss of an entire community or ecosystem. We can categorize habitat loss into different things. So one of these is called edge effects. And that means basically that when you take you just think about a very large square, and you reduce the size of that square, the area within the square declines quite rapidly compared to the perimeter of that square. So now the ratio of the area that exists, let's say a forest, is different than it was when the forest was larger. So if we're talking about the ratio of area to perimeter, we've got a massive change when we reduce the size of a habitat. And that has weird effects on communities. It can actually cause major disruption to the communities because now the species at the larger perimeter are actually more threatened. All right. So another thing that we see as a big form of habitat loss is deforestation. And this isn't just the removal of forests, but of course, when you remove the whole forest, you remove entire ecosystems. It is also not just the destruction of habitat. It can also be things like polluting environments to make a resource no longer available. It can be disruption like putting a road through a forest where now species cannot behave normally because their whole habitat is bisected by roads. It can also be due to things like habitat fragmentation, where we still have about the same area, but by adding roads and adding places to live, we actually are disrupting that native habitat. So instead of having continuous habitat, we have almost islands across what used to be a continuous habitat. Okay, another form of a threat to biodiversity is invasive species. Invasive species are simply non-native species introduced to a different habitat. And often when we add in an invasive species, what can happen is they take over. They either are a great predator and they take out many different species. They can be plants that take over as well. So you might be familiar with something like kudzu. And the whole idea behind invasive species is that this new interaction that comes from introducing a new species generates new interactions. And these species haven't been evolving together for a long period of time. So often the invasive species can outcompete and destroy the existing species. Sometimes these invasive events, are harmless, and other times they actually can be catastrophic for the species that exist. It also can do things like bring disease into populations. So especially in cases of animals, we see that moving animals between populations can often bring disease from one population or one continent to a whole other one. We can also get invasive species by when a species naturally advances its range. So many of you may be familiar with fire ants. Fire ants have had a natural range expansion where they've started to move north. What this does is they compete for areas to have their nests, they can destroy other species, and it can actually eliminate diversity within a population. There are a whole series of other ways we can get invasive species that we'll talk about a little bit in class. But you can see in some instances we get the introduction of large pythons into habitats due to pet trade. We can intentionally introduce species thinking it would be a good species to control another one. And then it also can just be a pure accident. The last two are also fairly important threats to biodiversity. So on the slide, you can see in the bottom left corner pelts from tigers and then some examples of overfishing. We use animals, of course, for resources. They are often our food sources, but they are also hunted for ivory, for horns, for ornaments, for status. They can be hunted for food or medicine, things like that. And we know that by overhunting, we can drive species extinct simply for these ornaments or horns or something that isn't actually for a resource. We also know that recreational hunting for top predators is probably one of the worst things that can be done because it has huge effects on the whole community, not just the predator itself. Lastly, as we've sort of been alluding to in our ecosystem lectures, climate change has had a major impact on biodiversity. It's resulted in habitat destruction. Simply by the melting of the ice caps, polar bears are losing their habitat. It's also changing habitats. We're getting warmer climates in northern environments, allowing species from what used to be more tropical areas to move north. Climate change also increases the rate of spread of disease, and it's not necessarily human-induced, but you get new interactions between species where diseases occur, and they have new interactions where diseases haven't had to invade these new species before. Okay? We also get these massive changes overall that result in bigger changes to populations. So things like habitat loss, where we change the climate in an area and we reduce the available habitat for species, can often have big impacts on things like genetic variability within a population. And what we'll do when we come into class on Wednesday is talk about the consequences of these threats rather than just making a list of what they are. Okay, so we also have ways to preserve biodiversity that have been fairly effective. We've already talked about the first one listed on this slide called ecosystem restoration. When we talked about the wolf being reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, we're talking about an example where we can bring back species that naturally inhabit a certain area to restore community functions. We've done this again with the bison as well, and even prairie dogs. Captive breeding is a process by which you capture individuals from their native environment, rear them in zoos and other facilities to make sure they have high levels of reproductive success, and then hopefully at some point these species can be released back into their native environments. But even if they don't, we have at least have restored that biodiversity by keeping them alive within a protected area. There's a really successful example of captive breeding with the California condor. And the cool thing about it was it actually introduced knowledge about the natural history of the bird that we didn't know before actually trying to rear them in captivity. Habitat protection is exactly what it sounds like. This is when we designate areas that are important, either because of their primary productivity or because of the amount or number of species that use them. We can do it because of the ecosystem function. But what we then do is then label ways to protect and avoid overuse, overhunting, or exploitation of these environments. Restoration of disturbance is an interesting one. This is one where we have previously decided that things like fire or natural processes are bad to environments. And so instead of just preventing forest fires altogether, we now actually burn to control brush and also to restore the effects of that disturbance, because there are many species who are adapted to things like fire that won't even germinate. Some seeds won't even germinate in the absence of fire. All right. Another thing that we can do is actually eliminate trade. So simply this means that if some countries actually say we do not allow you to bring certain elements like rhinoceros horns into our country, that prevents them from having monetary value. And that can actually prevent people from moving them between countries and then reduce the amount of hunting because the ornament no longer has value. And lastly, there is ecotourism, which has become incredibly important in the past few years. because what it does is it promotes the native environment and it recruits people to come see the native environment and appreciate the biodiversity that's there. And then the funding for the ecotourism actually can be used in the future to fund other conservation activities. To decide what conservation approaches to use with a given population or species or community, we obviously need to know quite a bit about each individual species or community we're interested in preserving. That kind of information we might need could include things like the general life history of the organisms in the community. So, for example, what does this organism need to reproduce? How does it reproduce? What type of habitat might it need? In addition, we also might need things like needing to know the ecological roles of the organisms. So, to what trophic level does an organism belong? Is it the main primary producer within a community, or is it a top predator? Then, once we know a little bit about the individual species of interest, we also need to know what's causing that species to decline. And then, there also needs to be an assessment of what happens if that species is lost. It could have impacts on the community itself, it could have impacts on the ecosystem, and we need to actually have scientific studies to back up understanding what exactly will happen if this species is lost. And it's not always straightforward. Remember the example of the sea otter we used, where removing the sea otter had major indirect effects on the kelp forest, and that wasn't an obvious connection immediately upon removal of sea otters. So what some conservationists set out to do was to develop a database that summarizes information like this so that the conservation status or the conservation information that we need is compiled into one database. And that is currently called the IUCN Red List. And it's not just a simple list of organisms, it's a lot more. It provides background on individual organisms, it summarizes research on conservation of these different organisms, and it also provides you just basic background on any given species you want to look at. It's also on the web, so that means it's educational to those people who look at it, and it's also public. So this information about the conservation status of organisms is readily available to anyone who's interested in looking at it. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. You can click on the link, or if you're watching this via YouTube, you can type in the link or copy it from the PowerPoint on Blackboard. When you go to this website, you will see that the majority of the background of the website is red. And then running along sort of the bottom or top of the website, depending on how your window is open, you'll see that there are a bunch of listed amazing species. Before we take a look at those, I want you to notice that in the red, there's this red banner along the top that tells you about the IUCN Red List, about how they build an assessment process, and then all the resources and publications that they use to build their assessments. So before we go on and talk about any individual species, go ahead and click where it says about in the top of the banner. There's a whole list of different things you can look at, but we'll just take a look at the background and history, and I'll let you guys look at other things as you have interest in it. But notice that if you scroll down, you get a text explaining where the IUCN Red List came from. And notice that what they've done is they've used bold text to really draw out things they think is important, things they think are important. And if you read through this carefully, you'll see that they've clearly outlined a statement about what their goals are as an agency and how they are meant to do this in a nonprofit way. This is not meant to be profitable, but rather be an informative tool for those people interested in starting to work on species whose conservation status is at risk. And if you scroll down, you can even find out exactly what % of things like reef-building corals are threatened with extinction. Once you've had a look at this, go ahead and scroll back up to the top and then click where it says Red List in the top left corner, and that'll bring you back to the home page. What I think a good thing for you guys to do before you go on to do the assignment for class is to click on one of the amazing species. For me, in the top left right now of the amazing species is Rab's fringe-limbed tree frog, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And immediately what you see is the common name of the tree frog and then its Latin name. You can see its last assessment date was in 2018, which is not very long ago. And then you can see right in the beginning its red list status, and that is currently going to be shown in almost a crooked teardrop shape, and for the species I'm looking at, it's critically endangered. Then you also see that the population trend is decreasing. That should be if you scroll down a little and look at the left side, you can see that it shows in general the habitat and ecology of the species. Most of the time, species will have what they call a geographic range, and the geographic range is the whole geographic area where you might find an organism, but not exactly where you'd find it. So it's not only going to highlight the habitat of forest, but it might also any habitat in that geographic area. Then if you continue to scroll below the map, you'll see things like the threats to biodiversity. You'll see the influence of things like invasive and other species, things like genes and diseases. And then in white, you see the conservation actions that are in place. It also makes recommendations for what conservation actions are needed. And this will vary from species to species. In the case of this tree frog that I'm looking at, it needs area protection. So what we talked about in terms of these slides, this would be habitat preservation or restoration or just plain protection. Notice also at the bottom you can see additional information that can be expanded no matter what you pick on. So since you guys have been working on biodiversity for this whole semester, you could click on taxonomy and it'll show you its classification system. So you can see in the case of this frog, it's in kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Amphibia, order Anura, and so on. And this will be different depending on which frog, of course, you pick on, or which picture you pick. And then you can see a little bit more information about how you'd actually identify the species. So this is a huge amount of data piled into one website, and it's available for most species. So if you didn't want to just pick one of the amazing species that they have, you could type in the common name of any species. And if you go ahead and do that, and let's try water bears, you can click on that and see what comes up. For me, there's no results for that. But you could pick your favorite species, like, let's say, jaguars. You click on that, and what you get is a whole series of different animals that are closely related to jaguar, including the jaguar itself, a jaguarundi, and so on. You could look at the different cats that are at risk. So what you guys are going to do next is you guys are going to move on and do this for one species as indicated on the next slide. There's going to be a handout on Blackboard as well. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is to go into the IUCN Red List and complete the worksheet that's on Blackboard along with this podcast about the Tasmanian devil. We're going to do an activity in class on Wednesday that will tie together the principles of conservation biology, this podcast, the Red List, and then a few other things that we've done since the start of this semester. You're going to turn this sheet in at the start of lecture on Wednesday, and then you're going to get a second handout that'll help you through the class activity. Of course, all of this material will be on the exam, or at least it's possible.